I lived in those days. The threat was real. But the threat facing Judah in the 8th century BC was even more real. The Assyrian army was already on the march. There are some hints earlier in this same chapter that the land had already been ravaged by war. If you look at verses 7 and 8, hear these words. Your country is desolate. Your cities burned with fire. Your fields are being stripped by foreigners right before you, laid waste as when overthrown by strangers. The daughter of Zion, that is Jerusalem, is left like a shelter in a vineyard, like a hut in a field of melons, like a city under siege. The prayers of the people in such a time would not have been empty prayers. They would have been desperate prayers, vigils that would have gone on through the night, accompanied by incense and offerings and sacrifices made in an effort to get God's attention and secure God's protection. And this is what God hates. Not so much empty worship as worship that is a means to an end. Worship that is supposed to do something rather than simply be something. And this is where we can begin to take the meaning of this passage from there and then to here and now. What was the threat to God's people at the end of the 8th century BC? Death. What is the threat to God's people at the beginning of the 21st century AD? Death, though not in exactly the same way. I can still remember the conference in which I heard a Methodist bishop say that his denomination was losing 200 members per day. Now, you can't go on like that very long without dying, even if you are a strong and powerful denomination. This year, the Southern Baptist Convention reported a decline in membership for the second year in a row. And when you look at individual churches, the threat of death only seems more imminent, more real. Last week I was talking with my uncle during a visit, and he asked about my staff meetings on Tuesday morning. How many people do you sit down with when you have a staff meeting? He said. And I said, oh, lots, probably 40 or 50 people sit down together for a staff meeting on Tuesday morning. Good gracious, he said, that's more than sit down in our church on Sunday morning. But even here, at Richmond's First Baptist Church, we are not immune. I pay attention to those membership reports. When the numbers are up, I breathe a sigh of relief. And when they are down, I swallow hard. How did the people of God confront the threat of death near the end of the 8th century BC? They prayed for deliverance. They burned incense. They offered sacrifices. And how have the people of God confronted the threat of death at the beginning of the 21st century AD? They have brought overhead projectors into the sanctuary. It's true. 30 or 40 years ago, someone convinced us that the decline in church membership was due to the fact that people found church boring, outdated, and irrelevant. And so we developed something called contemporary worship in an effort to liven things up a bit. The churches that embraced this model said, let's get rid of the hymn books and the choir robes and the unsingable songs. Let's throw all of that out and project praise choruses on a screen. They're easy to sing and they're fun. And while we're at it, let's stop dressing up for church, because really, God doesn't care what you wear. God only cares that you're there. So come as you are, please. And when it comes to preaching, let's do away with those boring biblical sermons and instead hear something relevant, easy to understand, with absolutely no references to the expansion of the Assyrian Empire during the 8th century BC. How about that? Is there anything wrong with any of that? Well, yes, I can think of at least 3 things. On a practical level, this approach plays right into the hands of our consumer culture. It works to create a worship experience that will attract people. But let me tell you the truth, people are fickle. And if you find that they are flocking to your worship service because you put on the best show in town, when you don't, they will not. When the church down the street hires a better band and calls a pastor who is young and hip and wears really cool glasses, people will start going down the street to that church. It's just how they are. And we will raise up a whole generation of religious consumers who simply go for the show. More to the point, contemporary worship has been used in an effort to increase attendance. And whenever we use worship, we abuse it. Worship is not a means to an end. It is an end in itself. It's what you do when you are so overwhelmed by gratitude for God's goodness that all you can do is say, thank you, thank you, thank you. Probably the best biblical example is that time when God brought His people through the Red Sea and the iron chariot wheels of the Egyptian army bogged down in the mud. When the waters of the sea closed over the army, when the Egyptians drowned, Moses' sister Miriam was so excited, she grabbed a tambourine, began to shake it and shout, I will sing to the Lord, for He has triumphed gloriously. Horse and rider He has thrown into the sea. She wasn't praising God in order to be delivered. She was praising God because she had been delivered. That's what real worship is all about. In our text for today, God is upset with His people because they are worshiping Him in order to get something from Him. His protection from the Assyrian army.